All right, folks. So, excuse my voice, a little bit under the weather today, but let's knock out the Cold War 1970s and look at some issues that happened here. Now, remember, when we look at this, again, we're chunking in decades. There are issues or situations going on, for example, the Vietnam conflict, that'll carry over from the 60s into the 70s. Okay, so we're going to have a little bit of a carryover there with that. And then there's some other points of interest or points of conflict that we're going to see making changes and making shifts as we move through the 1970s into the 1980s. And this decade really shows a lot of time change or a lot of change in world history as we move forward. So first off, let's look at one of the issues that still ties really back to the Vietnam War, and that's the My Lai incident that occurs down in Vietnam, where American soldiers are attempting to rid the Viet Cong, the North Vietnamese soldiers, from parts of South Vietnam. Excuse me. But unfortunately, they make a grave mistake thinking that the Viet Cong had left. They had been watching the Viet Cong in My Lai for a little while, thinking that they were going to leave at a certain point of the day, or the residents of My Lai were going to leave during a certain point of the day to go get food and resources for their family, and leaving the Viet Cong behind. Well, on the day that they were going to move forward with the attack, the people didn't leave. And the American soldiers went on with the attack anyway. And of course, this is the first war that's really truly guided by the media, and the media is actually involved. That information is going to return back to the United States, and there's going to be major backlash, not just in the United States, but we're going to lose a lot of world support here for this incident, because now, really, is this containment anymore, or what is the purpose of why we're in Vietnam? And the My Lai incident really shows how poorly it was run and the issues that we're running into down there in Vietnam. So, other issues that are going to go on too, here we are, we're in kind of a time of turmoil in Vietnam, but on the world stage we have other problems. In 1972, the Olympics are held in Munich, Germany, which is in West Germany, and there's going to be an act of terrorism there. Muslim terrorists are going to sneak into the Olympic Village and kill Israeli Olympians. And of course, here we are. Israel is a Jewish state. These are Jewish Olympians that are going to die. And even though terrorism is not new, but now we're starting to see a shift in religious terrorism, especially Muslim against Jews. In the 1970s, that's going to cause even greater issues as we move forward, because you got to think about the value of the Middle East. And no doubt is it a holy land for religions, especially Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, but it's also, a hotbed of resources when you talk about oil. So any kind of conflicts, between the Jewish state of Israel and anybody else is going to be a big deal. Plus, the American support and Western support for Israel is very important, since the UN and the West really created this nation state. And you have a lot of hatred of very fundamentalist Muslims who don't like this idea because their holy land has been taken away from them. All right. In 1973, you start to see movements towards the end of the Vietnam War. At the Paris Peace Accords, you actually have a formal agreement that acknowledges that the war is going to be over soon, and that the United States troops are going to start to pull out of Vietnam. Now, the big part of the agreement is that you're going to have basically, you're still going to have two Vietnams. At least that's the plan. But unfortunately, that's not what's going to happen, because North Vietnam is going to continue their attack on South Vietnam. Now, this is a little bit of more American history. You don't necessarily have to write this down, but understand, because of the failures of LBJ, the War Powers Act in 1973 no longer lets a president run a war without congressional approval. This goes back to the original constitutional principle that Congress declares war and not the president. All right, by 1974, as the last American troops are getting out of Vietnam, North Vietnam continues their attack on South Vietnam. And by 1975, the capital of South Vietnam, Saigon, falls, and you have one united communist country of Vietnam. All right, now, going back to really Cold War tensions, of course, that's a hot war that happened between the U.S. and Vietnam, dealing with communism. But we have another issue. Of course, you have this buildup of nuclear weapons that's going on. And even though this is not in your notes, you might want to write this down. There starts to be an idea of this concept that's called MAD, M-A-D. And the M stands for mutually, the A stands for assured, and the D stands for destruction. Mutually assured destruction. The idea that if we go to war, nuclear war with the Soviets, then we're guaranteeing the end of the world. All right, and that's going to be a problem that's going to lay through the 70s and into the 80s as we move forward. So at least for a time being, and this happens really under President Richard Nixon and with Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev, this policy of détente, they're going to start to relax and ease tensions between the U.S. and USSR. You start to see, like we mentioned, the space race, you start to see these two countries kind of work together. We had the joint docking of ships, the Apollo-Soyuz mission, where that's a policy of détente. They stopped the space race for a little while. They start to meet. You have what's called ping-pong diplomacy. Nixon is invited to China with the United States national ping-pong team to meet with Mao Zedong and the issues that are going on there. So you start to see a little backing down of tension between the two countries. Now, is there trust? Still not yet, but you still have this idea that, at least things are calming temporarily. So make sure you underline and highlight détente, because that's really important as we move forward, because the 80s are going to change that when we get there. So adding to this idea of détente are what are called the SALT treaties, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaties. Okay, this is where the United States and the Soviet Union agree to limit the amount of nuclear weapons that are being created. Again, here I mentioned this idea of MAD, mutually assured destruction. They wanted to avoid this at all costs. You got to understand, the hatred and the tension that's building up between the two countries is massive. Yet both of them realize that if we go to nuclear war, that's it. There is no more us. There's no world. There's nothing, because of the destruction that can happen. I mentioned this idea of brinkmanship. That means we're moving towards the brink of war. And neither country wants to do this, okay, because they know the destruction that can happen. So when you look at that idea, no doubt you're going to have these hot wars, these proxy wars that happen, whether it be the Vietnam or Korean War with the Americans involved, or what we'll see here in 1979 with the Afghanis. But it's this idea that if the Soviet Union and the United States come together and fight, it's over. So they really want to avoid this, so they make two treaties to limit this down. One is under Nixon in 1969 and 1972. The other one will fall under Jimmy Carter a little later in 1979. But it's an opportunity to kind of slow this down and make people more at ease, which it will temporarily, at least from a governmental standpoint. But it won't ease the tensions between the two sides from a cultural standpoint, because we still want to contain communism. These places in Africa and Asia are still looking at non-alignment, or which government they want to choose. And of course, it's going to roll into Latin America as well. All right, in 1973, going back to kind of what happened with the Munich Olympics, you have what is known as the Yom Kippur War. All right, Egypt and Syria, two very important Muslim nations in the Middle East, decide to attack their hated rival, which is the Jewish state of Israel, on the holiest day of the Jewish year. This is the Day of Atonement, where Jews essentially make up for their sins and their wrongs with other people. Normally, you don't fight on holidays, but this, for the Egyptian and Syrian Muslims, they felt like this was a great opportunity for them to attack and gain back the Holy Land. And again, Israel is going to be successful here. They're going to hold the Egyptians and Syrians off because they're willing to fight for their cause of their nationalism, their country, but they're also willing to fight for religious pride. And on top of that, the West and the United States specifically are supplying Israel with arms. All right, we are helping them be successful. And of course, this will drive a wedge deeper into Middle Eastern conflicts, especially with fundamentalist Muslims and how they feel about the West. But what's more important, not just the attack on Israel, is the energy crisis issue. At this time, the Western world is using more oil than anywhere else in the world combined. And specifically in the United States, we are using 5 times more oil in the United States than everyone else in the rest of the world combined. And most of the oil is coming out of the Middle East. An organization called OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And we're buying our oil from them. And now with this issue and our support of Israel, the price is going to get jacked up, and that's going to serve to be a major, major problem for the Western world. All right, so we have in 1973 the OPEC energy crisis. Essentially, it's an oil embargo against the United States. Now, they're not going to cut off complete funding. They're not going to keep sending us oil, but they're going to raise the price. Every month, they're going to raise it up about 5% more. And they're going to cut down how much is actually being sent. And this is where you have issues in the western half of the world, Western Europe and the United States, where people can't buy gas. If they can't buy gas, they can't get to work. And that's going to slow down production exponentially in the Western world. And by doing that, slowing down industrial production, you're going to, of course, affect the GDP of the country, affect the economy ultimately, and we're going to go into a crisis, an economic crisis because of this. And at the time in 1973, 1974, Nixon's going through his issues with Watergate, and Gerald Ford becomes president, and he cannot stop what we are going through, which is called stagflation. It's a stagnant economy that is seeing inflation in cost, and that's not a good place to be. It's terrible for the economy, and it's really driven by this oil crisis. Now, on the flip side, though, these oil-producing countries need the Western world to buy their oil. So, eventually it's going to come to a conclusion, but it's really going to stop with the end of the Arab-Israeli conflicts, at least temporarily in 1973, as we move forward. All right. Other issues in the 1970s we kind of look at. 1978, the Camp David Accords. Again, this goes back to Arab-Israeli conflicts. President Jimmy Carter brings in Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin and Egyptian President Anwar Sadat to meet at Camp David, which is the presidential vacation home right there in Maryland outside of D.C. And they essentially sit down and broker a peace. And there's a lot of kind of moving parts to this. Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat do not like each other. They have fought against each other in the Yom Kippur War. They have severe disdain for one another because of their religious and nationalistic backgrounds. But when they sit down at the table, Jimmy Carter is finding a way to kind of make this work. And both Begin and Sadat realize that this isn't about them. It's about the future of their countries and of the Middle East and what's going to happen. And in doing this, Egypt becomes a major supporter of the United States, and we become one of them. And they become really the intermediary in the Middle East. It's going to help major conflicts that go on there. Okay, so a peace treaty is signed. The three of them, or especially Jimmy Carter, will win the Nobel Peace Prize for this. Unfortunately, Anwar Sadat is going to be assassinated by a Muslim radical within the year. Menachem Begin is going to continue on as premier or prime minister in Israel and really push them forward into the 1980s. But it is the real first attempt at peace in the Middle East. Of course, it's going to kind of whittle away as time goes on, but at least now we have a Muslim ally that can really help us here. In 1979, talking about issues in the Middle East, you have the Iranian Revolution. Many of the areas of the Middle East had been kind of run by the Western world. In the case of Iran, the United States had implemented essentially a dictator to run the country who's going to be pro-U.S. and help with this oil issue. And that is the Shah. Okay, and the Shah was very much westernized. He had westernized Iran, made it very extremely progressive, but in the process had also become genocidal to a degree, took away a lot of human rights from a lot of people, and kind of broke away from traditional Muslim culture. And the Iranians, especially young Iranians coming up, did not like this because they felt like their rights were being infringed on. So what they do is they recall from exile the Ayatollah Khomeini, who had been a religious and political leader in Iran for many years, but was exiled because of his fundamental beliefs. So in doing this, the Shah is actually kicked out of the country, or leaves the country. Now, he is very sick. He's dying of cancer, and he has to flee the country, and he goes to Mexico. And there's a lot of fear in the issues of him coming to the United States. And in the process, Iranian students overrun the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, and they take hostages, American hostages, in this embassy without using a weapon. It put the Marines who were in control of protecting the embassy in a tough spot because they could not fire on unarmed civilians. And now we have a problem. And if the Shah, they want the Shah back to put him on trial for his war crimes, and we are going to protect him. I mean, he's eventually going to die of cancer, but now you have an issue where a hostage crisis kicks in, and you have a fundamentalist Muslim leader taking over against Western democracy and Western ideals. And here becomes that our first big divide between the two. And we'll discuss this in the next video, which will be very, very short.